I think we should start now.
Yeah,
So,
you can. Yeah.
good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I welcome Professor Barbara Harris White to India on this virtual platform. And so, this is basically this is going to be the keynote address, come the valedictory address by Professor Barbara Harris White. And this as if you see the keynote address then and the theme, then we had the theme 2, that is farm non-farm linkages for regional economic regeneration. And for this I don't think that we could have a better speaker than Professor Barbara Harris White. With this very brief note, I welcome Professor Barbara Harris White, and then I request Professor Bhavesh Sen, who is the president of the Odisha Economic Association, to preside over the meeting, and Professor Keshav Das will be basically moderating the session. So now it's over to Professor Bhavesh Sen.
Thank you, Dr. Das. Good afternoon, everybody. And also, good morning, very good morning to our guest Professor Barbara Harris White from Oxford University, UK. Welcome to this August gathering. We had a very good, vibrant academic discussions for last 2 days. It was a great learning. Soon we are going to start the valedictory session. It will start with the keynote address on the theme 2, that is the farm non-farm linkages for regional economic regeneration. Professor Barbara Harris White will deliver the keynote address. The title of a topic is Agrarian Urbanization and Urban Agrarianization in India today. Professor Keshav Das of Gujarat Institute of Development Research will introduce her to this August gathering, and he will also moderate the session. Now over to you, Professor Das, Keshav Das.
Thank you, Professor Sen, and thank you, Amarendra. We are extremely happy. We are very privileged, in fact, to have Professor Barbara Harris White amongst us today. I do not know how exactly to begin my introduction, so let's probably begin from the beginning. It's more than half a century now. In 1969, that Barbara travels from Cambridge to New Delhi, and she was driving. So that's how she reaches India. And that time, she was sort of maybe more into what is known as agricultural economics. And as part of her work, she had to travel to the Kishtwar Himal to climb mountains behind the inner lines of the source region of the river Chena. And as she traveled, she sort of came across, as she was traveling on the Grand Trunk Road, she came across sort of what she describes as the mountains of grain. And also, she was quite sort of intrigued by the what you call the magic of the wheat mandis in Punjab and Haryana, which, as we are discussing today, has attracted so much of policy attention and so much of. I mean, it is just a coincidence maybe, but I think the mandis have been at the center of today's political discourse in India, and with that 52-year-old initial journey, I think Barbara has been with us through her writings, through her engagement on discourses on India and otherwise, and she has a very, very special contribution for the Indian scholarship, if I may say, as she was the one who helped to establish at the Oxford University an MPhil in development studies in the year 1995, and also she sort of helped to introduce Masters in Contemporary India in 2008. And so I think those are very, very substantive contributions to India studies, but I think largely to studies on developing economy, studies on sort of democracies like ours. She served as the director of the Queen Elizabeth House. I think now it is called Oxford Department of International Development. So that's where she has sort of guided, I don't know, some 4 dozen doctoral students and postdocs, mainly from India. So very, very close association with India in that sense. And so her work is really, I mean, with 37 books co-authored, co-edited, and 268 journal articles as on today. So I think she has really traveled a long way, and as you can see, even on a casual Google search, you can see that she has worked extensively on a varieties of themes. Those relate to issues relating to informal sector, the relationship between state and market, issues on caste, on identity, on tribals, even on nutrition and poverty. So her work also relates to food systems, agricultural markets, long-term village and rural urban studies. I think that's one area which would be much closer to today's theme, and a variety of issues concerning deprivation. And of course, all her studies, very interestingly, I think very importantly, very often based on sort of field observations, personally going to the field. And I think from that, she has sort of, while she has seen things in action on ground, I think her contribution also has been on with reference to policy making. So I think I cannot list all the 37 books here, but then maybe 2 of the recent books is one, the Wild East, it's on the criminal economy, published by the University College London Press. And the second one, a very recent book, is Rethinking Markets, which is published by the Cambridge University Press. So in 2011, she retires from Oxford, and currently she's a visiting professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And having said all this, I mean, she is a global citizen, and so even if she might have worked more on India, but I think she's a person who is identified with rich inquiries into development studies, and her connection with Odisha today is, this is the first time she's with us. In fact, her connection is also with Odisha, maybe briefly, but through our friend Professor Deepak Misra at the JNU. So we are very, very happy, Barbara, that you are with us, and we are really looking forward to listening to you. Most welcome, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Professor Das, and good afternoon to friends in India. It's a great privilege to be with you. This is day 335 in my COVID confinement. I only go out for short walks. So meeting people through the miracle of Zoom is very important for well-being, for stimulation. And I have benefited enormously through being able to travel to India, sometimes several times a day. As Professor Das said, I'm not a regular economist. I cannot pretend to be. I work with them, but my fields are political economy, institutional economics, and the link between economics and anthropology. We might call it field economics. And I may have been well chosen to be the final lecturer because my experience is that Zoom conferences are stimulating, but they are also fatiguing. They make people tired. So instead of showing you slide after slide of data, I want to show you images and ideas. That is, if I can share my screen. Here we go. Is it up? Can you see it?
Yes, now you can make it full screen maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you
Yeah.
see it?
yeah, absolutely.
Very
Perfect.
good. I'm just going to minimize people. Okay, so my theme today is a new concept, and I want to turn the new concept on its head, and I want to criticize both of them. The new concept is agrarian urbanization. It's a concept in which political scientists, economists, geographers have already made contributions. What I find in the study of development is that we are constantly facing new concepts. So I want to start by going back 122 years to an old idea, old concepts, and to see how the new concept of agrarian urbanization maps onto the themes of the agrarian question, which were first formulated in 1899 by Kautsky. In the version laid out by Terry Byers some 30, 40 years ago, there are 5 parts, there are 5 questions to the agrarian question. And all scholars who are concerned with economic development would be doing well to study these questions. The first concerns the processes by which agriculture becomes transformed from peasant agriculture or feudal relations to capitalist relations, dominated by capital in a landed form on the one hand and wage labor on the other. Myriad trajectories, all of them need field research, substantive research by economists. Second, the second question are the changes that happen in agriculture which push labor out of agriculture, basic theories in economics. But along with that, which commodify, which turn into market exchange, food, water, energy, agro-industrial raw materials from agriculture to the rest of the economy. The third question concerns what we now know as the terms of trade, the prices between agriculture as a whole and non-agriculture as a whole over time, which may squeeze agriculture in order to purchase the same bundle of goods from the non-agricultural sector. So you can see the terms of trade as financial squeezers through which surplus materials and capital move out of agriculture into other sectors. And as Ashok Mitra said in 1977, between different classes in the economy. The fourth question is important for my talk, and it's the absorption of agrarian classes into a national market for consumption goods. Without that, you can't have a national development project at all, and it's often forgotten in the studies of agricultural development. And the last, fifth question concerns the role of states, of political interests, political players, and political conflicts in all of these processes. Because as you know, scholars of Orissa, these processes are conflictual, contradictory, and often involve violence. Now, recent additions, if we fast forward to the present time, recent additions to the agrarian question have included the possibility that all that is left in agriculture are rural classes of labor, because the other changes, the other resources that are needed for the rest of the economy can be obtained outside agriculture and or globally. So rural classes of labor, as societies, agrarian societies have become miniaturized, and as wage labor in agriculture becomes more and more important, have been added to the questions surrounding agriculture. Then there is a literature looking at the gendering of this whole process and the role of social identities such as caste or tribe in in this process of transition and of transformation. And people concerned with the ecological crisis have been beginning to study in depth the deepening of the metabolic rift. Those are the balances of energy and materials between agriculture and industry, and between town and country. And now we can you see this slide?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Good. Now we have this term, agrarian urbanization. Sai Balakrishnan, who's a development geographer at Berkeley, has written about industrial corridors. Carol Upadhyay has been writing about Andhra's new cities and its impact on the countryside. And Shubhra Gururani coined this term just last year. So this is a new term for what is going on. And she defines it as the endurance of rural land and caste relations inside rapidly growing towns and cities. So a lot of attention has been placed, as it were, on the fossil evidence of rural social relations that cement themselves inside towns and cities, which hitherto development theorists have regarded as, as melting pots for social institutions and for economic power. They're places of upward mobility. And the scholars of agrarian urbanization are saying not so fast, because all this evidence of historic path-dependent social relations gets woven into the fabric of towns and cities. Now, this is more or less all I will do to comment on agrarian urbanization as it's formulated by this body of scholars. What I want to do here is to spatialize and to share with you preliminary ideas about the agrarian questions of commodification and of politics, using an expanded concept of the agrarian, which consists more than of just land. So I'm going to be looking at the development of markets and of commodity relations, and looking at the spatial patterns that they make. And although I will make passing reference to water, energy, agrochemicals and machinery, the inputs to agriculture, the byproducts of the post-harvest system, the transport industry, and the residential and commercial markets that are developing in the countryside, I'm going to focus mainly on what I've studied through those decades that Professor Das mentioned, and that is agricultural commodities. Many people glaze over when you say you're interested in agricultural markets, but I find them exciting and important. And when I've done that, if there's time, I shall turn the concept round and look at urban agrarianization, again, rather selectively through markets. So that's my plan for this final talk in your conference. Okay, let us begin then with the marketed surplus. Now, during my working lifetime, the average marketed surplus in India has increased. It's more than doubled. I think in the late 60s and 70s, it was about 1/3 of production, and it's now averaging 70%. That is a very remarkable transformation in India. Agriculture has become commercialized, and for some crops, it is over 90%, for cotton, lentils, and pulses. And we must also remember that in states like Punjab and Haryana, as you're well aware, wheat and rice have marketed surpluses which approach that kind of level. And less so, about a half, for rain-fed, dryland, semi-arid tropical crops like millets and sorghum. And the question I want to put to you is the residual, is the non-marketed part of the Indian agrarian economy a subsistence economy? And I think, although crops may not be marketed, we have to rethink our ideas of what a subsistence economy might be in the 21st century, because it's not as though the subsistence economy is a non-cash economy. And we have to ask where the cash requirements for agriculture come from for that part of the agrarian economy which is not marketed. And I think there are a whole slew of very interesting questions about the role of wage work in families with small patches of land, about the role of remittances from migrant labour, and about the role of returns from the other crops of agricultural production which are marketed. So I feel that there's a very interesting research path there, simply revisiting the idea of subsistence in the 21st century. Then there's a literature in economics privileging the role of price and studying the role of efficiency, especially in what's now known as value chains, which I have things to say about later, but on the assumption that the prices that farmers receive determine their production decisions. So if we want to change agriculture, we have to get the prices right. This is well known to the audience that I'm speaking to. So the question for us is the first exchange of the marketed surplus with a trader dominated simply by supply and demand? Can we model it like that in the assurance that those are the only factors that really count in the creation of price? If you use official statistics, you can make models of supply and demand and price. However, if you go into the field and you study the behavior of markets, and you study them from dawn when the sun rises to dusk, or to when the traders, even after dusk, when the traders finally close their shops, what you find is a great deal of price dispersion in any given day, in any given marketplace. So this is a problem. What are the equity effects of these price dispersions? And what the literature suggests, even at this first moment of transaction involving the marketed surplus, is the role of economic power, the site of the sale, the volume, the quality, the degree of adulteration. Other goals on the part of the seller than maximizing profit they may have, or maximizing returns. They may have an income goal. There was a lot of literature about this in the 1980s, and these motives, which are non-profit maximizing motives, may still pertain in the play of economic power around the first transaction. And then we have the role of urban price bases, and they become very relevant to the debate about the role now of regulated markets. We have a literature on interlocked contracts and how difficult it is to establish the price of a commodity when it's related to interest rates on credit and to labor or to prices on inputs. Contracts which do this fuse and make the determinant of one part of it very difficult to calculate. And then the prevalence of cash, which is the dominant mode of exchange in agricultural markets even now, and asymmetrical payments. If I have to pay for something quickly, and when I sell it, I am reimbursed slowly, I need much more working capital than I would do if the velocity of payments were equal between two transactions. These are expressions of asymmetrical power. And then untransparent transactions, which are much affected by the urgency of the transaction, the holding power of the seller. So all these factors actually come into play when we have as our problem dispersion of prices in a market during a day, rather than weekly averages or monthly averages or minimum support prices. At the same time, it's even more complicated because there's a literature from socioeconomists and anthropologists about the role of reputation, sociality, caste and gender, and the fusion of market exchange with non-market exchange through this simple act of selling your harvest. And then we have a literature which is pieced together from many disciplines about the spatial relations of the marketed surplus. Some of it flows within a village from one part to another. Much is yielded up to itinerant traders who are also called brokers or aggregators or bulkers. Some of it goes through periodic marketplaces, which economists hardly know about. Much of it went through APMCs, through regulated markets, although the role of regulated markets has been uneven in different states and different agroecological regions of India. And of course, more and more, the marketed surplus of the larger farmers bypasses the town, bypasses the marketplace, and goes directly to processing factories. Okay, let us turn from the marketed surplus and that first transaction through to market systems and value chains, because what I find is that the debate in international circles on the food system and the debate in India on the food laws uses this idea as a value chain, which I've put on the left-hand side of this slide as a convenient and often the only depiction of the post-harvest system, which links agriculture and rural areas to non-agriculture and urban areas. Okay, it's simple. It has the allure of simplicity. But if you look at the diagram on the right, which I made of the same system in West Bengal, you will see that many things. One is that you cannot know how valid your value chain is unless and until you have studied the whole system. You don't know whether that value chain is the chain through which most marketed surplus flows until, it's a paradox, until you've studied the whole system. And studying the whole system is unavoidably long procedure. It is difficult. Methods to study this system have involved an application to agricultural economics from industrial organization theory, structure, conduct, and performance. I could talk for ages about this, but all I'll say now is that that conceives the post-harvest system horizontally. It's concerned with the competitive conditions under which transactions are made. Its replacement, the fashionable concept for the market, the value chain, conceives the marketing system entirely differently, as a ladder, as a vertical system, following a sack from one place to another through the system. But in my fieldwork, and over the years, I've got the life histories, the business histories of over 2,000 wholesalers and millers and money lenders and traders of all kinds. I ask them what they do. And this rather muddy slide is to make a different kind of point. If you ask traders what they do many things. They buy, sell, broker. They can transport, process, and store. And they can finance production through their lending, and they can finance trade itself. If you ask individual firms what activities they perform, what you find is a bit disappointing if you're going to make production function kinds of analyses and comparisons, because mercantile firms in agricultural markets tend towards three things: complexity, diversity, and uniqueness. And the rate of returns from complex individual combinations of activities may be systematically related to their diversity, or they may not, and they may be positively related or negatively related, as in these diagrams. And the conclusion that you have to draw when you do this work is, what are these firms doing if they're trying to be unique? They're not trying to compete with each other. And what the system does as a result is have this famous fashionable concept of resilience against shock, because if each firm did the same thing and a shock happened, they would be hurt in the same way. But if every firm is different and the same shock happens, they will not be hurt in the same way, and the system is much more resilient. So I've come to think that systems methodology and the starting hypothesis that the system is like an ecosystem with niches for different kinds of firms, with different kinds of activity, is how markets actually work. I'd like to be proved wrong. There aren't too many studies that would enable me to do that. Anyway, please take away the idea that the post-harvest system, being much simplified in the debates on the farm laws, is actually a very complicated thing. I think it's more complicated than production in India, and it's far less studied. Now, if we, for simplicity, go back to the vertical value chain conception of what's going on after the harvest, we encounter the idea of the distributive margin, which we can divide between rural and urban returns. And a recent example of rice in Tamil Nadu, to the south of Orissa, shows that the share of agricultural producers in the consumer's rupee is 75%. It's quite high. And the shares of all the intermediaries who act on the marketed surplus and transform it to your banana leaf or your plate amount to 25% of the distributive margin. Transport is about 2, in this case, milling and processing about 5, wholesaling with storage about 10 to 12%, and retailing about 6% of the distributive margin. So those are interesting in their own right, but it's even more interesting to think about them as the competitive outcomes of mixes of purely distributive activity, which are necessary to create markets through time and space. So buying, selling, brokerage, and finance, a mix of these kinds of activities and of productive activity like transport, storage, and processing. The point is that every single one of these activities represents some kind of competition, some kind of bargaining, negotiation, even conflict. That plus the exploitation of labor in the form of family labor, labor on labor markets, and the exploitation of other urban markets not associated with labor or commodities like the money market and the market for premises, for shops, for godowns, for factories, and so on and so forth. All of these markets are involved in that distributive margin. And here are some images, because it's the end of your conference. And these are images of what I'm talking about. And the way we need to look at them is to appreciate, yes, they're very interesting photographs, but they're embodying, hello? They're embodying all kinds of conflict and competition in the top left between labor and traders.
Sorry.
I think there might be a mic on. I'll go on. In the middle top between money lenders and a money borrower. In the top right, the capitalization of mills, which displaces other kinds of technology. In the bottom, the competition between farmers and traders, laborers and traders, and the displacement of labor through mechanization. All of these are interesting in their own right, but they're indicative of
I'm sorry. I think
about competition, conflict, and the dynamics that drive social dynamics that drive the market system. Okay, I'm going to move on, despite background noise, which I'm not sure is coming from Oxford.
no, maybe someone has not switched up. I made a request. Please, all participants, keep your mics in a muted mode. Please.
Except for me.
Yeah.
I think it is gone. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Please.
So
Yes,
moving from the distributive margin, linking producers to urban consumers, to another concept, the distributive share, which is the relation between total wages and total profits and the rate of return. Wherever you can actually calculate the rate of return to trade and compare it with other sectors of the rural economy, what we find is that the rate of return to trade and to money lending exceeds the rate of return to processing, and both exceed the rate of return to agricultural production. So you saw with the distributive margin that agricultural production takes most of it. However, the rate of return to agriculture is always less than that to trade and even to processing. Why processing has lower rates of return is to do with capitalization, but it's a nice little paradox that could be theorized by a good economist. And what we find is that the relation between wages and profits has undergone a huge shift in my working lifetime from labor toward profit. And what is profit? How do we calculate profit in trading firms dominated by family labor, which isn't paid? We can't, unless we impute that labor at a wage rate and we subtract from profit the consumption of the family, we can't really compare profit in trade in family business anyway with profit in corporate sector where all the workers are paid. So when, sorry, let me have a drink. What's actually flowing into your average agro-commercial company in India, sited in an urban market town, is what economists call residual claims. It's not profit. It's what's left over from costs, sales minus costs. And that residual claim, it then flows between consumption and investment. And those concepts are quite unclear because of the role of family labor in family firms. So you're investing in labor, and at the same time, you're investing in the consumption of the family firm. Until very recently, the sons of traders weren't educated because the fathers were too worried that the sons would go away with the family property. These days, it has all changed, and both girls and boys in agro-commercial firms are well educated in engineering, IT, and commerce, and bring those modern skills into agro-commercial firms. So we're getting a shift from in the market system to contemporary urban metropolitan India. Let us go on now to look at this process mapped onto the way in which those forces and economic relations, mainly located in towns, press on resources in agriculture. At the macro level, we have an indicator in the terms of trade. Now, the terms of trade is a snake pit because you can more or less get the results you want depending on which prices you choose to use and which year is your baseline. These are the problems that all the audience listening today are familiar with. Himanshu at JNU has used open market prices and thinks that using open market prices, which are the prices of which most producers exchange, agricultural producers exchange, that the terms of trade in the 21st century have been adverse to agriculture. But I say that knowing that there is a literature which argues the reverse. But as critical economists, we need to ask those questions about the price data and the baseline year, which can be manipulated to get the conclusion you want. So that's how the resource extracting role of these value chains or market systems which link rural and urban spaces, that's how the macro level role works. But at the micro level, we can look at the way in which agricultural traders start with capital from agriculture, make profit or residual claim, invest in trade or non-agriculture, they invest in the rest of the economy, and they shift resources that way from agriculture to the rest of the economy. And the agrarian question has been grounded in a lot of assumptions, actually, that agro-commercial capital, that is the arhatias, the wholesalers, the brokers, the millers, and so on, have grounded their enterprises in land-based profits and rents. That is, in the transition to capitalist agriculture, the profits from capitalist agriculture have been invested in agro-commercial capital. And Sharad Chari, looking at Coimbatore, even found that savings from labor were amassed and formed starting capital for agro-commercial enterprise. Now, this agrarian-based assumption or hypothesis about the agro-commercial economic base of market towns is likely to be reduced in those regions of India where migrant business castes have been prevalent. And we know that migrant business castes have come from Rajasthan and migrated throughout North India, even in Bangladesh, even in Afghanistan, and have come south into less densely into the southern regions of India. And there, the agrarian assumption is less likely. And firms tend to be grounded in commercial profits and in loans from banks. Now, what we find, and I've looked at this question in Tamil Nadu, several regions of Tamil Nadu, several regions of West Bengal, is that it is true that agro-commerce used to develop portfolios based on agricultural rent or profit and used their profits to transfer resources and develop the agro-commercial sector itself. And there were theories of parasitic urbanism, where towns were theorized as being based on rent and an overblown agricultural marketing sector. However, now, if you ask a coal store owner or a big miller what they invest in, and I've put their portfolio in purple here, you'll see a massively diverse set of investments. They are no longer cooped up in agro-commerce. They have leapt over the barriers to industry, finance, other sectors of the economy, property, stocks and shares, fleets of transport, finance itself, money lending, education and college campuses, supermarkets, cell phones, telecom, etc., etc. So now those at the micro level, the story is that urban agricultural traders are investing in the whole of the rest of the economy. And what that means is that the attribution of capital to agrarian or industrial, to rural or urban, is really open to question, because these guys are investing in everything. And this is the commercial class, which is actually threatened by the farm laws, which we might discuss afterwards. Okay, onwards. So if we deconstruct these processes, what we find is that there's a rich core of institutions in the expanded concept of the agrarian as it's expressed in the commodity economy of market towns. We find a great number of private commission agents, wholesalers who are bulking surpluses, accrediting deals, sometimes collusively, and financing production and trade. And we also find processors, stockers, transporters, and commodified service providers, people repairing equipment and machinery. and financing the whole process. So a very diverse set of institutions, but with patterned activities, distinctly stratified in complicated ways, often by local caste configurations. Although if you've looked at caste and small market towns over a long period, you know that castes are internally differentiating and also dissolving at the edges. They're not rigid, they're plastic kinds of institutions, but they do stratify still the firms that throng in agricultural markets towns. They're also stratified by assets, by economic power. And this disguises the fact that many organizational combinations and permutations coexist, bringing together farms, firms, and families. So we look at a marketplace, we see large numbers of intermediaries, but we cannot draw from the fact that there are many intermediaries conclusions about efficiency or competition because of these stratifications. Many towns and markets are comprised of an oligopoly that takes 90% of the marketed surplus or the supplies, and a very large number of small-scale, self-employed, petty traders, which are more or less dependent on the oligopoly. And as I say in the next part of this slide, cross-cutting these caste configurations will be, and cross-cutting agriculture, agro-commerce, and non-agricultural commerce in a market town, you find self-employment and petty trade and production. And there are a lot of debates in political economy about what this is. And I could talk about this, but won't. The conjectures are that these are really labor in disguise, or these are forms of production, a man with a bike and a sack, that are transitional to larger kinds of economic enterprises, or know that they're autonomous and that they're a form to be reckoned with, which is neglected by economists and planners. What we find is that self-employment is persistent, it is segmented from wage work, and that it expands. So it expands by multiplication of small units. And so the other way market towns are stratified is through the coexistence of differentiated technologies. It's quite amazing to me that in one town you can find, say, 4 or 5 different cotton ginning technologies or oil crushing technologies, so that the law of one technology, which assumes that the most efficient technology will prevail, it doesn't hold when one goes out and looks at technology in market systems. So institutions and technology are rich and they are varied. Inside these stratified, sometimes complex systems, and I talk about them as systems, there are some tensions. There are 2 that I want to share with you today. One is the tension between accumulation and economies of scale and capitalization on the one hand, and the need to avoid contact with the regulative state on the other. And what that does is to lead to the multiplication of small units, not necessarily self-employment, but including that, through subcontracting, outsourcing, and process splitting, in order to avoid the size threshold, which attracts regulative attention of the state. The second dynamic that we find in the literature is to do with informality. And the informal economy is a binary. It's tremendously useful to think with because it draws attention to the limits of the regulative scope of the state. But what we find, if we actually look at the ways in which firms engage with regulative law, what we find is, again, something very complicated that needs more research. And that is selective engagement with regulative laws. So firms which routinely operate outside a regulated market yard now obsolescent, big research topic there, they are licensed. So they're not operating in an unregistered environment, although some may, but the firm I'm stylizing is licensed. It also has bank accounts, maybe has 10 bank accounts. However, its credit relations, that is its money lending relations, are informalized and may not be represented in written form at all. Its premises have not been inspected for building standards. The waste it creates flouts environmental laws. Think of rice mills. Think of the enormous piles of straw and burnt husk that pile up outside the walls of rice mill compounds. This kind of firm also isn't above siphoning electricity. Famously, it ignores the Factories Acts in the way it organizes wage labor, and it will accept informal accreditations for skilled, specialized, contracted-in work. And it exploits dramatic differences in the terms and conditions of remuneration between family, whose remuneration is on a customary basis, regular labor, which is entitled to perks, and the casual labor force, where every attempt is made to keep it casual and ununionized and paid as low as conceivably possible. This kind of firm does not, it may maintain accounts, but it doesn't maintain accounts that can be inspected by others, and it also seeks to evade tax. It belongs to a joint family. The joint family will own agricultural land which is registered, on which rental arrangements, labor arrangements, exchanges of credit, the circulation of seeds, commodities, labor relations, and shock-absorbing insurance are all unregulated or regulated through institutions of custom. Now, this is complicated, but my point to you is that this won't go away if you don't study it. And often if we make assumptions about it, it's wrong. And so one very important assumption that I want to put to you is the idea of informality versus formality, registration versus lack of registration, or unregistered economy, is now, these days, a simplification of what's actually going on in India. Okay, and just some images of the theatre of rice mill. A lot of women labor, paid very poor wages, contract labor increasingly, very harsh physical conditions. And in the bottom right, you have no idea from this photograph whether the person who's putting, I think it's soya, into the mill is self-employed or is a wage laborer, which is just my point, that we need to know about process and relations and not simply look at surface phenomena. Okay. So if the state is only regulating these markets in a partial way, what is keeping order? Because these markets are not chaotic. They're complex phenomena, complex systems, but they are not chaotic. And what keeps order is a multiplicity of self-organized economic institutions. Some labor unions, mostly urban, business associations and chambers of commerce, definitely urban, and they regulate disputes, they police entry, apprenticeships, contacts and information, raise money for bribes, and so on and so forth. And then the social institutions of identity, such as kinship, gender and patriarchy, ethnic solidarity, caste, religious authority, and all the practices that are poorly understood that cling around places, individual places. R.J. Gandhi has called it multiple sovereignties. So this value chain that's being talked about in relation to the farm law becomes more and more and more complicated. And they are, what are they doing? They're supplying the collective preconditions and the regulative activities that enable agricultural markets to operate, both competitively and often collusively. And yet, even in this informal economy, complicated as it is, the role of the state is significant. Thinking about this and thinking about towns and countryside, I was reminded that in the 1970s, after the first wave of the Green Revolution, there were a lot of debates about growth centres. And the problem for planners was, can you actually plan towns? Can you plan service centres? And I'm not sure, well, I think history has shown that we can't do that. However, it's not that these central places, these agricultural market towns, are not political units through which physical infrastructure and non-physical services to agriculture are channeled. So the urban state supplies physical infrastructure for this complicated system to take place. So the regulated agricultural markets, heaven only knows what's going to happen to them, because they do perform an important role, currently disputed. Fertilizer depots, roads and railways, and energy, of course. And then non-physical services to agriculture flowing out from towns, economic subsidies for inputs, particularly agrochemicals, water, energy, and seeds, and also the procurement system, because what the big study of markets in 3 Indian states, not Punjab and Haryana, in Bihar, Orissa, and Chhattisgarh, I think, has shown is that where the state procurement at minimum support price is actually operating, prices, open market prices, are lifted and smoothed, so that the recent paper on agricultural markets published by the University of Pennsylvania last year showed that it's the case in 6 of India's 27 states that the existence of state procurement at the minimum support price smooths open market prices, so it has an effect on the rest of the economy. So there are debates here also about public-private investment synergy, and a paradox, because what you have is flourishing market towns of the sort that I'm trying to describe with agro-commercial capital, growing, concentrating, accumulating, centralizing, but coexisting with underdeveloped and poor quality infrastructure. So that is something that we also need research on to query the assumption made by macroeconomists that private investment and public investment go together. Here we find they don't go together, that private investment prevails and grows, while public investment is of poor quality. And there are also debates concerning not just the supply of utilities and state services in growth centres based on agricultural markets, but also about the demand for them. And here the literature is talking constantly about the capture of these services by agrarian and agro-commercial elites, which contributes to the loose coalition of intermediate classes, a concept borrowed from Mikhail Kalecki by K.N. Raj in 1973, which seems to have stood the test of time. Okay, so that's thinking of market towns as centres of supply, and let's add a few comments on market towns, urban central places as centres of demand, because it's very surprising that even now, well, the reference is 10 years old, but there's nothing since then. The Shukla reference shows that over half the consumer expenditure in India's towns are for commodities which originated in agriculture. So that's despite the huge development of other sectors after 1991. Half the expenditure in towns is still based on agricultural commodities. For me, that's quite an amazing finding. And of course, the nature of that demand is determined by distributions of income between town and country. Often the average income of a town dweller is multiples of the average income of a rural dweller. But rural societies are much differentiated and form polarized classes shaped by their land relations, which in turn reflect the forces of landlessness, of differentiation, and of persistent miniaturization. As you all know, 86% of India's producers have less than 2 hectares. That affects demand from Indian towns. It affects the national market. Now, this process is regionally uneven. This is one of the last points I want to make about agrarian urbanization. This is a map of wage labor, the proportion of total workers who are wage workers in agriculture. And what I want you to look at is the East Coast. Orissa isn't amongst the brownest areas, but the East Coast is very brown. And I want you to keep that map in your minds when you look at these maps, which are the maps of the commodification of agriculture in terms of commercial inputs on the right and the marketed surplus in the center and the left. And there, the dense areas are a completely different area. So you have wage labor to the east of India, but you have commercialized inputs and a higher incidence and density of marketed surplus in a belt, north-south belt in the west of India. And that's telling me, hey, there's a topic for research, but also this is very uneven process regionally. And before I just go on, look at Tamil Nadu and the marketed surplus, because I want to talk about Tamil Nadu and West Bengal, north of Orissa, in the next slide, simply to substantiate the point about uneven development. So these market towns, the outcome of agrarian urbanization, are uneven. And it is known through Rukmani's study for Tamil Nadu that the size and the spacing and the economic function vary systematically with cropping pattern, infrastructure, the distribution of small-scale activity, and specialized caste-related agro-industrial clusters which pervade India, and thus agrarian structure and class formation. So towns and their nature are related systematically to the processes that are going on around them. And we can develop this with 3 scenarios, suggestive, and it's I'm not claiming that they're complete at all, but we can see frontier estate areas cultivated with migrant labor with a precocious urban agro-industrialization, the scenario for Coimbatore. We can see smallholder production with a dense scatter of market towns dominated by agro-commercial capital in the north of Tamil Nadu. And we can see landlordism, interlocked contracts, and very, very little rural urbanization with resources screwed from agriculture and capital fleeing to the metropolis, which is a scenario for central West Bengal. And the non-local migrant trading castes cut a swathe through all this and are known all over India to be extracting surplus in very flexible ways and extracting them and redistributing them throughout the country. So there, again, there's a lot of potential here for new research. Okay, I'm through with agrarian urbanization. I want to pause for just a few comments on the concepts. One is the idea of towns. The census classification has its own definition, but when we start applying new technology, satellite photography, and the new field of night light pollution mapping, and there's a French project called Indiapolis, which has used these new methods, what we find is that the census town is about half the number of actual towns, and that the rate of low-end urbanization is much higher from these visual data than as calculated using official statistics. So we have to rethink what we know a town to be. And when we talk about agrarian urbanization, what we're doing is conflating a sector, agriculture, with spatial arrangements, rural and urban. And I think what I'm trying to do in this talk is, as far as I can, as far as the literature lets me, disentangle spatial arrangements, the rural and urban, from the sectors, which are simplified down to agriculture, industry, and services. And we know there are so many exceptions to this conflation, including big firms in agriculture, multinational corporations, even in plantations and mines and quarries. And so I feel that it's more honest not to conflate the sectors with the spatial arrangements, and to, unfortunately, to have new terms. And my favorite is the rural-urban complex. But other scholars have talked recently in the last 18 months or so about extended urbanization, and even a nasty phrase, functional urban rural territorialization. And these are scholars who are desperately trying to get a concept to cover the kinds of processes I've spoken about. Okay, do I have 5 more minutes to finish off?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Bob. Yeah, please.
Okay, I'll go quickly through the reverse, because just which is also a concept which has to exist. If we have a agrarian urbanization, we must then think about urban agrarianization, even if we think about it critically. And this is the part, this is responding to the part of the classical agrarian question concerned with the making of the national market. So you'll be sitting in Orissa and in India thinking, yes, this may all be true, but agriculture is declining vastly as a proportion of GDP. And of course, this is correct. And as agriculture declines, so agricultural profits, rents, and multi-source savings are also declining as sources of urban capital. That's exactly what we find. And market towns develop industrial clusters, they develop administrative functions, service sectors, modern ones like education, or old ones which add to and replace artisanal services. And they become wholesale hubs for retail economies which are sprouting up in villages. And what we find, and we find this in the literature, that the power of farmers' politics has declined. That is, present protest accepted. But until the protests about the farm laws, I think it's fair to say that farmers' politics had really fallen off the radar. And their concerns about agricultural prices and about energy prices were not really taken as paramount importance in policy debates. That's changed. Meanwhile, the rural non-farm economy is expanding, and there are huge debates about the role of distress and poverty in this versus speculative investments. Remember the late, great A. Vaidyanathan and C.P. Chandrasekhar's debates about distress, diversification. There are debates about petty production and wage labor. Is it just wage labor in disguise? There are debates about the efficiency of small-scale enterprise in the non-farm economy, and about the threat that self-employment and petty production actually undercuts capital, which uses wage labor and can't deploy wage labor past the point at which the returns that they produce equal the wage. So lots of debates about the nature of the rural non-farm economy. And the expanding town, with its origins in agricultural markets, will now reflect the class and income composition of demand from its own population, plus the purchasing power of rural classes and the constant throughput of more or less impoverished rural-urban commuters and migrants. Okay. We can see this process in terms of capital investment. And there's now a new literature on the seizure, I think ever since, gosh, it's just gone out of my head. Is it Singrur in West Bengal, where there was...
Singrur, yeah, Singrur, yeah.
Singrur, sorry about that. But
It's okay.
ever since then, and probably before then, urban capital has purchased or seized private agricultural land, common land, wasteland, and then proceeds to protect it physically by walls, barbed wire, or by force, and reclassifies it and speculates on it. And we see a new literature celebrating or bemoaning new forms of production, new relations of production, hobby farms, share tenancies on lands of absentee landlords where there was never share tenancy before, and so on and so forth. And we watch materially and demographically dense forms of land use satisfying the rising rents in villages. And again, people are forced to try to invent terms for what's going on. And you read terms like a post-agrarian hinter landscape, post-agrarian meaning that agriculture is no longer the prime force in the village economy, and hinter landscape in that these regional economies are focused on towns. Now, that may be happening, but rural panchayats are resisting reclassification as urban because if they are reclassified, they have higher tax obligations. And so what we find is that these towns are starved of revenue, which affects infrastructure in the way that I described. And here we have some images of what's going on, including an amazing cartoon from Canada in 1880, which reminds us that this process of urban agrarianization is not confined to India or the 21st century, where an agriculturalist is faced with land, go back to Kansas, don't come to Canada. This land is sold for speculators. This land is going for the friends of the government. This land is not for sale. This land has been sold to an English company. So you can translate what that settler is looking at in terms of processes which are going on in villages, in the bottom right, an SEZ, and the center bottom, high rises in Indian villages, and the engulfment of Indian villages by cities. Okay, and here, this idea has been captured in art by the photographer Gauri Gill and the artist Rajesh Vangad for Warli in Maharashtra, where the modern economy is being superimposed on tribal societies, okay? And this process is not just an economic process, but that the non-economic aspects of this process have economic consequences. If we make the transition between urbanization to the concept of urbanism, Goshen Mir last year described it as an eruptive, uneven, relational, historical process whose dynamics extend far beyond the sites of agglomeration, i.e. towns. And the point is that telecoms, media, and the lived experience of travel and mobility are transforming rural demand by status aspirations, by taste, and by the compulsions to imitate. This is not what John Mellor theorized in the 1970s as growth linkages for consumption linkages from agriculture. This is something else. This is the metropolitanization of rural demand. And what is happening is in many cases a tragedy, because petty production, small peasants, agrarian labor are incurring debt as never before to invest in indicators of status and modernity. And one example, top left, are comparatively lavish dowries, and they develop unrepayable debt relations, which they can do little about but juggle. And Isabelle Guérin, the French social economist, has done years and years of work on the complexity of these debt relations, which will never be repayable. And what they also do, which becomes a welfare tragedy, is to forego expenditure on what we as outsiders consider to be their basic needs, such as food, and will even reduce the number of daily meals in favor of consumer durables, television, top right corner, on new installment contracts to a new scale of itinerant trader moneylender, a much bigger scale of money lending. Okay, now my last point, which you may not be expecting, but I want to make it all the same, is that if we're looking at urban agrarian flows, we have to start considering waste. All commodity economies generate waste. There is no exception to this. I live in a commodity economy which generates vast quantities of greenhouse gases as well as material waste. So we depend on nature as a tap to provide us with resources, but we also depend on nature and the countryside as a sink for the waste. We find that in agriculture, very obviously, and this was first discussed in the mid-19th century, that the marketed surplus, which I began with, is extracting minerals from the topsoil, from the land. And the depleted soil is, now we know, inadequately compensated by commodified chemical additives, by fertilizers, by agrochemicals. And this is creating what political ecologists call a metabolic rift. And we can see in India developing a number of crises which have at their roots depleted agricultural resources. We also see that waste is India's fastest growing sector. We think, we don't know, but about half of it is reusable. The labor force that gains livelihoods from the waste economy is dominated by low-caste, rural, urban, migrant workers, often working in a casualized, sometimes bonded way to privatized waste companies, or operating unregistered, informalized as self-employed people in the huge informal economy of waste, which has to be relied on because municipalities do not have enough funds to formalize the waste labor force, and neoliberal ideology and public management is favoring privatization and contractualization. So the whole process of informal waste sector is overdetermined in India. Now, the debate really concerned in the 19th century was, why don't we recycle the biodegradable urban waste to rural areas as compost? And what we find is that that really isn't happening in India, or at least you can see photos of it happening, but these are exceptions. Very little biodegradable waste is recycled to the land as compost. What happens to it is it is consumed. Edible waste is feeding a massive backstreet animal rearing industry. In a 1 lakh town that I've been studying since 2015, there are several thousand pigs and goats and cattle, not counting chickens and dogs. So there is an enormous informal economy using the edible waste, but the waste from that economy is joining the waste which has no potential value, which isn't recycled, plus our waste, human waste, to form negative externalities for economists. Public bads is another way of describing this waste. Now, these images, which I'll go through quickly because I think my time is up, are of the waste industry of a small town, different kinds of waste, very poor people, malnourished waste workers in the top left, unregistered economies, and informal in the center left. This is a photograph from a bridge on top of Apollo Hospital's waste. And you can see that the lorry is being plundered by women in the informal economy who will recycle that waste, which is infectious waste sometimes, for reuse. Okay. And why is it important to add waste to the topics that I've raised with you this afternoon? It's because a lot of the waste which has no reusable possibility travels through the opposite of composting and regeneration and intensifies the metabolic rift and is dumped in rural areas. It's tipped onto dump yards on the outside of urban areas. It's deposited in common land in rural areas. It oozes over private land, particularly the land of Dalits. It's hurled into river courses, which are often dry. It's incinerated far from towns and close to villages which object to that. And what does it do? It toxifies local water bodies. This photograph is of a tank. It looks very pretty, but it's completely full up of sewage and is lifeless. It has no fish anymore. It's toxified. And it decommodifies. It removes people's access, market access to rural assets. And the point I want to make, this is practically the final point, is that whereas the waste literature and waste research in India thinks of it as urban and thinks of and very rarely thinks about the final destination of this waste, waste is now being generated on a big scale in rural areas from agriculture itself, from the rural non-farm economy, and from village society and village consumption. And you only have to look at the rough of plastic bags surrounding most villages and abandoned quarries full of waste being grazed on by cattle and dogs and oozing toxic gas as indicators of the way in which this part of urban rural relations toxifies the air, the water, and the soil and degrades the resource base of agriculture. So here are some images of what I've been talking about the rural destinations of urban waste. This is my final slide. So we need systematic study of the rural-urban complex, but it's incomplete without integrating the spatial and the social economics of waste. And here we have a difficult contradiction. Yes, waste needs integrating into the social, spatial study of this expanded concept of the agrarian, of agrarian urbanization and of urban agrarianization, if you will, if you find those concepts useful. But the metabolic rift is no longer a marker of the frontier between agriculture or non-agriculture, or the frontier between town and countryside. It is everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barbara Harris-White, for a rich, complex, brilliant, comprehensive presentation with a lot of new ideas and ideas for research, especially for younger scholars. You have, by sort of wading through the complexities of what we may describe as new or emerging spaces of market systems, you have really brought us to a path where we do no longer see the limits between the rural and the urban. So we see the blurring boundaries, and as you very appropriately titled your talk, so I think it is a process of agrarianization of the urban, and your points about several institutions. I would imagine that both formal and informal institutions, and many institutions which are sort of visible and many not visible, as you sort of rightly pointed out, which are sort of very much outside maybe the formal regulatory frameworks, but then they do operate, and how they marginalize on the basis of a large number of constructs, like maybe certain kinds of identities, certain kinds of socioeconomic base. I think all that gives us actually a new idea. And so we are no longer thinking in terms of farm, non-farm linkage as we thought in terms of generating only employment, or kind of seeing as a benevolent linkage between the rural and the urban. I think your lecture also leading us to a very complex, and I think, as you very rightly said, that much less researched area of what is happening to the waste and who is creating this, and who all are going to maybe there is a small class which is benefiting out of the so-called waste economy. I think those are the real larger issues we have raised, and I think it's just simply such a. I also think a lot of your ideas came because of your very, very close observation over the decades, and your travel across the country, both in the rural and urban areas. I think that probably has enriched our sort of learning about the rural-urban dichotomy, and I'm sure a large number of scholars would pick up ideas from your talk. And because it is also on the YouTube, this will stay for a longer time. And because of time constraint, I do not know whether we should go in for any question answer now, but maybe I do not. I leave it to the secretary and president. If you think we should allow 1 or 2 questions, or we formally.
Just one question, if somebody wants. So yeah, just one question from.
This is Pavitra. So first I congratulate Professor Barbara Harris for a wonderful presentation. He has thrown a lot of new ideas that future research avenues that we can look forward to make this urban aggregation a successful story. But I'm just wondering that is it that urban aggregation is possible with that poor quality of like public investment in case of India? So what is your view on that? I'm thinking it is not possible with that poor quality of investment that is happening in India.
Barbara, if you could please.
The late Isha Ahluwalia waxed eloquent about this problem, the poor quality of infrastructure in small towns, not in the metropolis so much, but out of the sight of most people, even out of the sight of the kinds of urban environments where people like you who work in universities and live on university campuses can see. But if we look at the 7,000 small towns in India, she pointed out some years ago, about 10 years ago, the very poor quality of infrastructure. And my point is, yes, this is true. Part of the problem is finance. Part of the problem of finance is that the towns are slopping over into villages, but cannot raise revenue from those villages. So that there are huge revenue constraints in small municipalities. And that means that to get the investment resources for infrastructure, they have to be organized through state government departments. And there we have, and I'm thinking of a particular town, we have a problem of politics, because if your municipality is dominated by a party which is not in power in the state, you're much less likely to get the infrastructural funds from the state departments that you need to provide the infrastructure, not just for your town, but also for the hinterland, the rural area around the town. So I think it's a very, very difficult problem. Firstly, panchayats don't want to be reclassified. Secondly, as everybody knows, there's a culture of non-compliance, fiscal non-compliance in India, which means that, and there's a big literature on capital flight from India, and local level fiscal non-compliance won't be solved unless the really big actors in tax evasion square up or are punished and become compliant. So I see two processes which deprive the local state of the resources that it needs to provide the infrastructure that benefits towns, small towns, but also all the rural population around the towns. It's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for your answer.
There is an interesting question from Surabhi. So I think this will be the last question,
Yes.
if you allow. So Surabhi is asking thank you for the fascinating talk, Professor Barbara. I was wondering about the idea of resilience and resistance by informal workers against the exploitative working conditions. Say, for example, at the rice mills. Could you please reflect a bit on this with a few examples you might have come across?
What I come across is ununionized labor forces in these market towns. So loaders and unloading labor forces are often unionized, but it's rare to find the labor forces in rice mills or in wholesale mandis unionized. Now, this is where some of the literature on APMCs has remarked on their capacity to organize labor, the labor involved in marketplaces. And that's true, but it's not widespread. So the main problem I see of labor in marketplaces is that employers seek to casualize as much of the labor force as possible and to keep as regular salaried employees only those people whose work they can't do without. So I'm thinking of the accountant and the engineer, the repairer of machinery. They're all regular labor. Their salaries depend on loyalty and on age, and they are entitled to perks, but they're not unionized. They have these vertical relations of patronage almost in a market situation. So I see a great deal to do in the territory of labor, organizing and resistance to win back. Excuse me, I can't stop this. This is my end. To win back the distributive share, which has gone away from labor and toward profit. So this is a process which is a historical one, and it can be undone, but it requires an enormous effort of organization.
I don't think we will have any more questions because of the time issue. So thank you so much, Professor Harris White. It's such a pleasure. It's a great opportunity to listen to you. And as I said, that it will really help the younger scholars to pick up ideas. So with this, may I request Professor Bhavesh to say the last words, please. Sir, you have to unmute, sir. Bhavesh, sir, you have.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Harris. It was very excellent deliberation, very interesting, very educative. We look forward to listening to you in future. It will be our pleasure to listen to you in future. And now we are going to start our second session. So would like to bid goodbye, and please have a nice day. And thanks again for spending your valuable time with us.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you, everyone.
So now we'll start the remaining part of the valedictory session. We have introduced the Best Paper Award this year to encourage young and talented researchers. The awardee will get a cash prize of 10,000 and the certificate. Amarendra, am I correct? Is 10,000?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, fine. A jury has been constituted for the purpose. The members are Professor Keshav Das of Gujarat Institute of Development Research, Professor Uday Shankar Mishra from CDS Center for Development Studies Trivandrum, and Professor Mitali Chinara from Utkal University. I would request Professor Uday Shankar Mishra to make the announcement of the name of the recipient. Over to you, Professor Mishra. Professor Mishra, are you there?
He
Who was there?
Okay.
He was there.
Okay.
He's there. He's there. Mr. Sir, are you there? Sir is there, but then I think he has to unmute. Let me make a telephone call otherwise.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, okay, let me.
Should we wait? Yeah, I think we have to wait. Otherwise, Professor.
Let us call him. I'm calling him up. Give me a minute.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Sir is joining. Actually, I think he had some issues in unmuting himself.
Okay.
So he's trying to unmute.
Okay. We'll wait. No problem.
So,
This is very such a nice lecture, isn't it? I mean, like she covered
yeah,
such a
so good. Yeah.
just
He
really
covered actually a vast array of issues. And,
this is almost like the TV shows. You see, there's a little sort of the tense, what do you call tense moments before the prize is announced. So it almost looks like that.
Yeah, sometimes we have to wait for some minute.
yes, yes.
That makes you more eager to know the result.
Yes.
Drama.
I think
Amalika, can you hear me?
yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we can.
Sir, video टा on करंतु. Mr. Sir, video टा on करंतु.
Okay.
Video टा.
Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, please announce the name of the recipient of the best paper.
Hello.
Sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amarendra.
Sir, yes, sir. Should I share? You make the. Okay. So let me then explain the process actually that actually we followed, and then I think Mr. Sir would announce this. As the president of the Odisha Economic Association, Professor Bhavesh Sen, announced that we had a jury, and that included Professor Uday Shankar Mishra, Professor Keshav Das, and Professor Mitali Chinara. So the papers were reviewed actually before the presentation for the content, and that content had 75% weight, and the presentations had 25% weight. And based on that, the best paper has been chosen, and this will be now announced by Professor Uday Shankar Mishra. So now it's over to you, sir.
Okay.
I think
This is my pleasure to announce the best paper award among the papers presented and shortlisted for this award, the award goes to Mr. Anand Meher for his paper on indebtedness and migration.
If Anand Meher, if you could please come on. Okay.
Okay, let me just unmute him so that
Yeah,
at
yeah.
least.
Yeah,
Okay, so Anand, you can now speak.
yeah, let him put the video on. Okay.
Yes.
Can you allow him to put the video on? Yeah.
Yes.
Ashwin, come here.
Anand, now you can speak. If yeah, he's there. So he needs to unmute and speak.
Is it audible, sir?
Yes, you are. You can put your video also on.
Please put the video on, please.
Actually, some problem in my laptop, sir, so it's not. This problem.
That's okay. Yeah.
I really I'm very happy to listen it. My paper means awarded for best paper award in this seminar, and I'm really thankful to firstly to means all the jury members and the president of the organization and secretary. Means give me chance and selected my paper for this best paper award. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Congratulations, Anand.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Congratulations, Anand. Keep up your good work. Okay. And now
Yes, sir. Thank
we
you.
proceed to the next item. Professor Suryanarayan Tripathi, former professor of Gokhale Institute, Pune, will take over as the new president for the coming year. I congratulate him and request him to speak few words to the audience.
I don't know if
Professor,
he's there.
Professor Tripathi is there?
No, sir, I cannot see him.
Okay. Okay, then maybe we'll ask him to do it later. Okay. So we go to the if please telephone him to join so that Amarendra,
Sir.
are you contacting him?
Yes, sir. I am trying to contact him. Yes, sir. Give me a minute, sir.
Okay, sure.